What happens when a routine traffic stop turns into a life-altering moment? When one officer's mistake spirals into a national scandal? A black man in uniform, subjected to racial profiling and humiliation until one call changes everything. General David Stewart had been through the worst the world could throw at him. But this time it was different. He wasn't going to back down. One call brought the Pentagon to her doorstep, and the truth was about to unfold. Stay tuned for this shocking story that will leave you questioning everything. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more incredible real-life stories like this. General David D. Stewart had driven Highway 220 between Albany and Americus, Georgia many times before, so the landscape was familiar to him. The curves, the quiet stretches, the occasional small-town gas station, none of it was new. But today his GPS had malfunctioned after a recent update. When he spotted a gravel pull-off near a faded green sign that read Ellaville 4, Michigan, he slowed down and stopped. He parked the car, tapping his phone screen, military-grade encryption that would shut down entirely if tampered with. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just a plain polo and slacks, the jacket with his insignia folded in the backseat. He figured he didn't need it, just a quick stop. But then he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. Looking in the rearview mirror, he saw a cop car with flashing lights, though no siren. A beat-up cruiser with faded lettering, Shell County Sheriff. The driver's door opened, and a tall woman with blonde hair tied in a bun stepped out, wearing aviator sunglasses and one hand resting on her holstered sidearm. She didn't approach cautiously. "Good afternoon." "No license and registration, sir," she snapped, marching straight to his car and tapping on the window. David rolled it down halfway. "Afternoon, officer. What are you doing out here?" she asked sharply. "Pulled over to check my GPS," he replied, trying to remain calm. She squinted at him, then glanced inside the car. "Where you headed?" He glanced at her name tag, Wilbur. Her voice wasn't curious, it was authoritative. "Just correcting my route," he explained. She stepped back, unstrapped her holster. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "For checking my GPS," he asked. "You're on private land. This is a known area for illegal dumping. You fit the profile." "The profile?" he asked, but she didn't respond, stepping further back and placing her hand fully on her gun. David exhaled and slowly opened the door. He was used to being stared down, whether in Iraq, Bosnia, or in DC's conference rooms. But this felt different. This wasn't right. "I'll step out," he said evenly. "But I want to be clear. I've done nothing wrong." "You're being uncooperative," she shot back. "I've complied with every word you've said." His voice remained calm as he followed her toward the back of his car. No backup, no body cam visible. Her radio crackled, but she didn't answer. She ordered him to place his hands on the trunk. He hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm a federal officer," he said. "My ID is in my vehicle. Please allow me to retrieve it." "I said hands on the trunk," she snapped, grabbing his arm and turning him forcefully. His palms slapped against the warm metal, and she kicked his legs apart. He didn't resist, but he quietly said, "You're making a mistake." She didn't listen. A pickup slowed down on the road, and a woman in the passenger seat rolled down her window slightly to hold up her phone. A teenager in the back was already filming. No one intervened, but everyone watched. There was something unsettling about it, in the silence, in the way he didn't flinch, in the way she seemed more eager to assert power than ask questions. Officer Wilbur was breathing hard, not from effort, but from adrenaline. She didn't yet know who she was dealing with. Something was about to shift, and it would start with a single request. "I'm not going to repeat myself," Officer Wilbur barked, her hand still hovering near her gun. "You're being detained." David didn't move. He kept his hands on the trunk, calm and measured. "Then I respectfully request that you call your supervisor or allow me to retrieve my ID from the vehicle." "You don't make requests right now," Officer White snapped. "You wait." David noticed the teenager from earlier standing outside the truck, phone still recording. The kid's father stood next to him, arms crossed, watching silently. The air was thick with tension, like the humidity rolling off the trees. "I'm not resisting," David said again, slower this time. "But I do need to identify myself. I'm Lieutenant General David Stewart. My ID is in my briefcase inside that car." White scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "You expect me to believe that?" she said. He replied, "You don't have to believe it. Just check. Instead of checking, she moved to the side, radioing something in a low voice. Her words were muffled by static, but David caught the phrase suspicious male and possibly armed. That last part made him turn his head. I'm not carrying a weapon, he clarified. White shot him a glare. You're military, right? You people usually are. David blinked slowly. You people. White ignored him, focusing back on her radio, calling for backup. She was asking dispatch to send help to County Road 19 for a possible developing situation. David didn't interrupt. Years of training had taught him to let arrogance collapse under its own weight. He looked past her toward the truck. The man in the driver's seat had shifted, his expression now unreadable. The bystanders, once merely curious, now looked uncomfortable. You're escalating something that doesn't need to be, David said gently. You don't tell me how to do my job, White replied, stepping closer. I'm asking you to do it by the book, he said calmly. Are you threatening me? She demanded, his eyes narrowed slightly. No, Mom, I'm advising you. White's lips curled briefly, as if she found his response amusing. But then she grabbed his wallet from his back pocket and yanked it out. She flipped through it, not really reading the cards until she froze. There, tucked behind a department ID, was a Pentagon-issued security clearance card. Level 4, she muttered, staring at it. David remained calm. I earned it over 30 years of service. She closed the wallet and stepped back, but not enough to acknowledge her error. You could have just said that in the first place, she replied, her face flushed but not from the sun. You still can't park here, she said, grasping for a reason to hold her ground. I wasn't parked, David responded. I was pulled over, adjusting my route. White turned away as if remembering her cruiser. David could see her considering the situation, how it looked, what the footage might show, and what it might not. You'll need to wait here for the responding deputy, she said, her tone reluctant. Fine, but once he arrives, I'd like to make a phone call, David said. You calling your lawyer? She asked, skeptical. No, he replied. I'm calling the Department of Defense. She stared at him, expecting a smirk or a punchline. There was none. Before she could respond, a faint siren started in the distance. Another unit was responding, but it was still at least 10 minutes away. In those 10 minutes, everything would change. This wasn't going to be a quiet story swept under the rug. Too many people were already watching. The sirens grew louder, bouncing off the trees. But White wasn't waiting anymore. She knew her grip on control was slipping. David could see it in her pacing, the way she glanced over her shoulder at the growing crowd near the roadside. 3 cars had pulled over, all filming. White was no longer thinking like a cop. She was reacting like someone who felt cornered. Turn around, she ordered. David didn't move. I've already identified myself. You're still interfering with a lawful investigation. I'm not interfering, David replied calmly. I'm standing here unarmed and cooperating. She grabbed his wrist and twisted. You're resisting. He clenched his jaw but didn't fight. She pulled his arm behind his back and slammed the cuffs on. The metal dug in as gasps echoed. A teenager moved closer, whispering to his father, who started filming. Everything's being recorded, David said. It matters. Wilbur hissed, not now. She pushed him toward the cruiser, rough and trying to prove something. She shoved him inside without a word. No Miranda rights, no explanation. You're going to regret this, a voice said. It was from the man with the teenager. Wilbur snapped, mind your business. This is my business now, he replied. Wilbur slammed the door and fumbled with the radio, her voice shaky. David sat in the back, cuffed, breathing slowly, focusing on the seconds. She hadn't verified his credentials or the Pentagon contact number. The teenager zoomed in with his phone. It says U.S. Army on the jacket, he whispered. More sirens. 2 cruisers pulled up. Deputy Lamar Boyd stepped out, calm, not rushing. He walked to Wilbur, who met him halfway, arms crossed. Boyd looked at the cruiser, then David, and opened the back door. Sir, your name? David Stewart, United States Army, David replied. Boyd blinked. Did she see your ID? Boyd nodded, closed the door and spoke to Wilbur in low voices. She looked defensive. Boyd came back, opened the door and handed David his phone. Anyone you'd like to call? David nodded, taking the phone with steady hands. He knew the number by heart. There were only 3 people he ever called directly in the Department of Defense. David Stewart called Major Kendall directly, informing him he was being unlawfully detained in Schull County, Georgia. After confirming his ID and credentials, Kendall alerted the Pentagon and military police. A few minutes later, Commander Reeves confirmed that local authorities would be contacted in under 10 minutes. David calmly handed his phone to Deputy Boyd, who made his own call. 5 minutes later, 3 black SUVs arrived. Colonel Errol Gaines, well known in military circles, stepped out, bypassing Boyd and White. He went straight to David, confirming he was fine and stating, "We've got it from here." Gaines confronted White, pointing out that she had arrested a 3-star general without verifying his credentials. White tried to defend herself but was silenced. Gaines informed her that this would be reported to her department and the state attorney general. Deputy Boyd radioed for the county sheriff while White remained silent, realizing the severity of her actions. David stepped out of the cruiser, his wrists red from the cuffs. He didn't complain as the crowd quietly watched. Colonel Gaines asked if he wanted to press charges, but David chose to hold White accountable per channels, letting the public see her actions. Videos of the incident quickly spread across social media. Sheriff Frank Roberts arrived 10 minutes later, observing the scene before stepping out of his truck. He calmly asked what was happening, and Colonel Gaines explained that White had unlawfully detained a general. Roberts turned to White, who hesitated, admitting she didn't verify his ID. Roberts warned her that her actions could cost her job. He apologized to David, who said the situation was about White's actions, not him. Roberts announced that White was being placed on administrative leave, ordering her to hand over her badge and firearm. She complied, and Roberts walked away, holding her badge like a burden. "We'll let the investigators handle this," Sheriff Nike said loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't how we treat people in my county. No one deserves what I saw in those videos." The teenager stepped forward, offering to send a copy of the footage. Nick smiled faintly and thanked him. David put his jacket on, the stars on his shoulders catching the light, and White walked away, but Deputy Boyd took the keys from her hand. She wasn't going anywhere without answering questions. By the next morning, the footage had gone viral, gaining over 2 million views in under 12 hours. Hashtags like General Stewart, Schull County, and profiling camera dominated social media. News vans arrived, treating it like a crime scene, though no crime had been committed by the man in cuffs. General Stewart remained silent, choosing not to speak publicly, instead making a private call to his wife and driving quietly to Fort Benning. The sheriff's office issued a sterile statement, omitting the fact that Stewart had more command experience than the entire department. Protests began outside the sheriff's office, and reporters dug into White's past complaints, including 3 formal grievances over the last 2 years. Despite her lawyer's defense, no training or procedure justified what the public had witnessed. General Stewart kept his head down, making only a brief public comment at a veterans forum, where he quietly spoke out about the incident, though it wasn't meant to be covered by media. "I've faced hostility abroad and worked under administrations that didn't want me in the room, but I've never felt smaller than on that Georgia roadside," General Stewart said. "But I won't carry anger. We need accountability and honesty. We can't fix what we pretend doesn't exist." The room stood in silence, acknowledging his words. 2 days later, Sheriff Frank Roberts announced Megan White's termination for excessive force, failure to follow protocol, and misuse of authority. Behind closed doors, he admitted she had been caught doing what everyone had known. Her firing sparked discussions in schools about respect and power. The Rearan family, who filmed the incident, were invited to Washington for recognition. General Stewart returned to Fort Benning but addressed new cadets, telling them, "Wear this uniform with honor, but some will always see what they want. Stand tall because justice isn't loud. It's steady, and it never forgets." 3 weeks later, the incident was still being discussed everywhere, with people asking why it kept happening. General Stewart never leaned into victimhood but spoke about transparency, dignity, and restraint. He spoke at a leadership conference emphasizing real restraint, strength in not retaliating. Power isn't in how hard you hit, but in how much you choose not to. And that choice, that's where real power lies, he said. When asked how he stayed calm, he smiled and replied, "My life wasn't in that moment. It was in everything before it." He also admitted to anger, saying, "Anger weighs you down unless you down. It makes you sharper and helps you speak when it counts." Back in Schull County, things began to change. A new training program focused on perception and implicit bias was implemented for every officer. Deputies were required to take this training as a correction, not punishment. Sheriff Roberts, despite his flaws, hired independent consultants who had experienced profiling to guide the process. Community panels were formed, sparking necessary conversations. Megan White faded from the headlines, moving to a new county and finding work in private security. The Rearant family returned to their normal life. Meanwhile, Miles, the teenager who filmed the incident, started a YouTube channel discussing integrity and justice. His first video, titled "I Didn't Know Who He Was, But I Knew What Was Wrong," gained 500,000 views in a week. David watched the video quietly one evening, feeling certain that his calmness made the difference. It wasn't his rank but his restraint and decency that exposed the injustice. In the end, the truth shared on a phone was what made the world see itself differently. Sometimes standing still while others watch is the greatest form of protest. 3 months later, the ripples of that day were still felt, but life had settled into a new rhythm for everyone involved. The community had begun to heal, though the discussions on justice and accountability continued. The conversations had sparked real change, not just in Skull County but in nearby areas as well. Sheriff Roberts, reflecting on the events, privately acknowledged the transformation that had taken place in his department. The new training was beginning to shift the mindset of his officers, but the work was far from over. Officers were now more mindful of their actions, knowing the consequences of misconduct were no longer easily ignored. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Miles, the teenager, had gained a modest following on his YouTube channel, continuing to document stories of integrity, justice, and accountability. His videos became a platform for honest conversations, the kind that people were hesitant to have before. He spoke openly about the lessons learned from the incident, reminding his audience that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about humanity. David, still keeping a low profile, returned to his duties at Fort Benning. His sense of calm had carried him through the ordeal, and he carried that into his work. He remained committed to his mission, continuing to teach new cadets about honor, leadership, and the importance of standing tall, even when faced with adversity. He knew that the power of restraint and dignity could change the world, one small action at a time. The scars of that day would never fully fade, but for those who had witnessed the injustice, the lessons remained clear. That change came not with loud protests or anger, but with quiet strength, standing firm in the truth, and demanding accountability when it mattered most. 1 year later, the impact of that day had rippled through the community, leaving lasting changes in its wake. The conversations about racial profiling, abuse of power, and justice had evolved into real action. Schools were holding mandatory discussions on respect, accountability, and the importance of fairness, while local organizations had begun to partner with law enforcement for deeper cultural sensitivity training. Sheriff Roberts had made significant efforts to reshape his department, bringing in more diverse voices and working to rebuild trust with the community. Officers were more aware of their biases, and many had taken personal steps to engage with citizens in ways that built rapport, not fear. It wasn't perfect, but the shift was undeniable. Miles, now an even more established voice for justice and integrity, had seen his YouTube channel grow exponentially. His interviews with veterans, teachers, and civil rights advocates reached millions. His work, alongside stories like David's, had spurred national discussions about law enforcement practices and how society viewed authority. Miles had become a powerful advocate for change, using his platform to connect people and challenge injustices wherever they appeared. David had continued to serve with honor at Fort Benning, though the events of that day remained a part of his life. He'd become a quiet symbol of resilience and dignity, often invited to speak at leadership events and military forums. But he never sought the spotlight. Instead, he let his actions speak for him. His story had been shared in countless classrooms, leadership seminars, and town halls. He was often asked how he had managed to stay calm in the face of such an unjust situation. His answer never wavered. It's not about the battle you fight, it's about how you fight it. Despite everything, David still believed in the power of quiet resistance. His calm had been a weapon stronger than anger. It was that stillness that had made people stop and listen. It had started with one man standing firm on the side of the road, but it had grown into a movement, a reminder that justice was not a loud roar, but a steady, unyielding force that could move mountains when people had the courage to stand by it. Note: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.